They say Harvey Gibson owns half of Manhattan, a man who makes federal judges flinch and empires crumble with a single text. For 20 years, he's been the sun around which the city's darkest stars orbit, untouchable, cold, and calculated. But tonight, the natural order of New York didn't just bend. It shattered. It didn't take a rival billionaire or a government raid. It took an exhausted waitress with an auburn braid and tired eyes. In exactly 4 seconds, Georgina Holt didn't just challenge him. She intellectually dismantled him. While the elite of the city watched in a suffocating silence, she stared into the soul of a titan and saw the one flaw he'd spent a lifetime hiding. "You asked," she whispered, her voice a calm blade in the dark. "If you've ever felt like the world was underestimating the fire inside you, you're exactly where you belong. Hit subscribe. You're going to want to be here for the moment the invisible girl becomes the most dangerous woman on Wall Street." The velvet room smelled of single malt scotch, expensive leather, and the heavy, humid scent of secrets. It was a place designed for predators to rest their claws, a dimly lit sanctuary where the city's power brokers could sit in expensive proximity and remind each other of the hierarchy. Georgina Holt moved through the shadows like part of the architecture. She was the ghost in the red apron, a woman who had mastered the art of being furniture. For 14 months, she had carried trays and cleared glasses, her eyes always flat, always scanning, always dropping back to the floor before anyone could see the calculation behind them. She was hiding in plain sight, a brilliant crisis manager whose former life had been incinerated by a corporate frame-up 3 years ago. Her team, the people she called family, were gone, and she was the only one left breathing. Now, her only goal was to remain a shadow. But Harvey Gibson was not a man who let shadows stay still. He sat at the center booth, the undisputed king of the room. At 48, he carried himself with the weary gravity of a man who had seen everything and owned most of it. His sleeves were rolled up, revealing the old military ink on his forearms, and his gaze was a constant, restless inventory of his empire. To everyone else, he was a legend. To Georgina, he was a variable, a high-risk asset who was currently being bled dry by the man sitting to his left. Victor Crane. Georgina saw it in a heartbeat. She saw the way Crane subtly angled a secure tablet away from Harvey's line of sight. She saw the minute hesitation in the digital ledger Crane was presenting as a success. It was a billion-dollar hemorrhage disguised as a routine acquisition. "Think you're tough, sweetheart?" Harvey's voice cut through the room, deep and unhurried. He hadn't been looking for a fight. He was bored, testing the edges of his world. He reached out as Georgina passed, his hand closing around her wrist with the casual arrogance of a man who thought everything in the room belonged to him. "Prove it," he challenged, his thumb pressing into her skin, not with violence, but with the weight of a man who had forgotten how to ask. The room froze. For 14 months, Georgina's discipline had shouted apologize, shrink, disappear. But 3 years of buried genius roared back to life. She didn't pull away. She leaned in. With her free hand, she reached down and tapped the corner of the encrypted tablet on the table. Her fingers moved with a clinical, terrifying precision. In 4 seconds, she swiped through 3 hidden layers of the subledger data Crane thought was invisible, and highlighted a single, cascading red line of code. It was the digital equivalent of a throat cut. "Your coup isn't acquiring a subsidiary, Mr. Gibson," she said, her voice a low, steady hum that silenced the entire lounge. "He's laundering your liquidity into a shell company in the Caymans. If you sign that authorization, your empire collapses by Monday morning. You're being liquidated from the inside out." She let go of his wrist. She didn't stay to watch him gasp. She didn't stay for the shock that paralyzed Victor Crane. She simply straightened her apron, picked up her tray, which hadn't spilled a single drop, and walked toward the kitchen. Harvey Gibson, the man who owned New York, stared at the tablet. For the first time in his life, he felt the floor drop out from under him. He didn't call for his security. He didn't yell. He watched the auburn braid disappear through the swinging doors and felt a spark of something he hadn't felt in decades. Hope. "Find out who she is," he whispered to his head of security. "And don't let her leave the building." Georgina walked into the cold night air of the alleyway, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. The silence was over. The hiding was done. She had saved the king, but in doing so, she had walked straight back into the war she thought she had escaped. If this story touched your heart, Please don't forget to like the video and share your thoughts in the comments with those who believe that destiny can change everything one day. Subscribe because when destiny shifts, everything changes. She looked at her shaking hands that were no longer meant for carrying trays, but for tearing down empires. She was no longer furniture. She was the storm. The file on Harvey Gibson's mahogany desk was thin, but every word on the page carried the weight of a spent shell casing. He didn't look at the photos of the burning office in London or the redacted names of the 8 analysts who had disappeared into the gears of a corporate scandal 3 years ago. He looked at the woman sitting across from him. Georgina wasn't wearing her red apron anymore. She wore a dark, sharp blazer she'd kept at the bottom of her duffel bag for a day she hoped would never come. Her auburn hair was still in that practical braid, but her eyes, once flat and invisible, were now terrifyingly alive. They were the eyes of a woman who had seen the bottom of the abyss and decided to climb out. "Georgina Holt," Harvey said, his voice vibrating with a rare, quiet respect. Or should I say, the ghost of Canary Wharf. The most brilliant strategic analyst the EU ever produced. Framed for a multi-billion-dollar embezzlement you were actually trying to stop. You didn't just lose your job, Georgina. You lost your entire team. Your family. Georgina didn't flinch. She sat with a stillness that made Harvey's high-priced security team look restless. "They didn't just frame me, Harvey. They erased them. And I've spent 3 years making sure I stayed erased, too. Until a Friday night in a lounge where I let a bored billionaire pull me back into the light." Harvey leaned back, his leather chair creaking, the only sound in the vast, silent study. The room was a fortress of books and shadows, a place where the untouchable man finally looked human. He slid a glass of amber liquid toward her, but she didn't touch it. "I don't need a waitress," Harvey said, his gaze dropping to the calluses on her knuckles, marks of a woman who had trained herself to survive more than just spreadsheets. "And I don't need a bodyguard. I need the genius who saw Victor Crane's betrayal in 4 seconds when I've been blind to it for 20 years. 20 years is a long time to trust the wrong person," Georgina replied softly. She looked around the room, noting the cracks in the book spines, the way Harvey's hand trembled ever so slightly when he reached for his drink. He wasn't a titan. He was a man holding up an empire that was rotting from within. "Crane isn't just stealing your money, Harvey. He's stealing your legacy. He's been layering your acquisitions with poison pills for 18 months. By the time the board realizes it, you'll be the one facing the sec while he walks away with the keys." For the next 4 hours, the billionaire and the ghost didn't speak of power or money. They spoke of the cost of it. Harvey told her about the early days, the military ink on his arms, the dirt under his fingernails before he had a silver watch. He spoke of the isolation of the top, the way loyalty becomes a currency that everyone tries to counterfeit. In return, Georgina spoke of her team. She spoke of the guilt that tasted like copper in her mouth every morning, the weight of being the only survivor. "I'm tired of running, Harvey," she confessed, her voice cracking for the first time. "I'm so tired of being invisible." Harvey reached across the desk. He didn't grab her wrist this time. He placed his hand flat on the wood, an invitation. "Then stop running. Stand with me. Help me burn down what Crane has built, and I promise you I will give you the resources to clear your name. Not as my employee, as my equal." The alliance was sealed in the quiet of the 3 a.m. dark. Over the next week, Georgina moved through Gibson HQ not as a shadow, but as a phantom in the machine. She sat in the back of boardrooms, her laptop open, her mind weaving through the digital labyrinth Crane had constructed. She watched Victor Crane during the morning briefings. He was a man of silk and steel, his smiles perfectly calibrated. He treated Georgina with a condescending politeness, thinking she was just a security consultant Harvey had picked up on a whim. He didn't realize she was a Volf who knew exactly where his jugular was. But Crane was no amateur. On Thursday, as Georgina navigated the encrypted server logs, she felt a cold shiver. A ghosting command appeared on her screen, a digital handshake she recognized. Someone was watching her, watch them. She looked up. Across the glass-walled atrium, Crane was standing by the railing. He didn't look away. He raised his coffee cup in a silent, mocking toast. He didn't just know she was there. He knew exactly who she was. "He's moving faster than we thought," Georgina whispered into her comes to Harvey. "The subledgers are shifting." He's preparing for a total digital purge. Then we move tonight, Harvey's voice crackled back, steady and grim, that evening as the sun dipped below the Manhattan skyline. Turning the glass towers into pillars of fire, Georgina sat in Harvey's private office. They were surrounded by monitors, the blue light reflecting off their faces. The air was thick with the scent of ozone and impending battle. "You're sure about this?" Harvey asked. He looked older in the artificial light, the weight of 20 years of friendship with a traitor finally settling on his shoulders. "He thinks he's playing chess," Georgina said, her fingers hovering over the keys. "He doesn't realize I've already set the board on fire. We don't just stop the transfer, Harvey. We trap him in his own lockdown." She saw the first ripple in the code. A massive liquidation order, disguised as a system update. Crane was pulling the trigger. "Here we go," she murmured. But as her fingers hit the first sequence of the counterstrike, the lights in the entire building flickered and died. The hum of the servers plummeted into a terrifying silence. The backup generators didn't kick in. The electronic locks on the doors hissed shut, sealing them in. Total blackout. In the sudden, suffocating dark, Georgina's breath hitched. This wasn't just a theft anymore. This was a siege. "Harvey?" She called out. "I'm here," he said, his voice a low growl in the blackness. "He's locked down the entire infrastructure," Georgina said, her mind already mapping the dark corridors of the building. "He's physically at the main server room on the 40th floor. He's going to manually wipe the evidence and leave us locked in here while he disappears." She stood up, her pulse steadying. The fear was gone, replaced by the cold, sharp clarity of the crisis manager she used to be. She reached into her bag and pulled out a small, high-intensity tactical light. "Stay behind me, Harvey," she said, the auburn braid swinging as she turned toward the door. "I know how these buildings breathe in the dark, and I know exactly where Crane is hiding." The hunt had begun. Not with guns or blades, but with the terrifying brilliance of a woman who had nothing left to lose and a billionaire who had finally found something worth fighting for. If this story touched your heart, please don't forget to like the video and share your thoughts in the comments with those who believe that destiny can change everything one day. Subscribe because when destiny shifts, everything changes. The silence of a dead skyscraper is unlike any other. Usually, a building like Gibson HQ hums with the electric heartbeat of 1,000 servers and the distant whir of high-tech systems. Now it was a tomb of glass and steel. The red emergency lights pulsed slowly, like the dying embers of a fire casting long, distorted shadows across the marble floors. "He's disconnected the primary grid and bypassed the emergency overrides," Georgina whispered, her voice tight but controlled. She stood by the reinforced glass door of the executive suite, her fingers tracing the keypad. "It was dead. This isn't just a blackout, Harvey. It's a digital fortress. He's turned your own security protocols against us." Harvey stood behind her, his silhouette massive in the dim crimson glow. He didn't look panicked. He looked like a man who had finally seen the true face of his enemy. "Crane spent 2 years designing this system," he said, his voice a low vibration in the still air. "He always told me it was to keep the world out. I never realized he was building it to keep me in." "We don't have time for the stairs," Georgina said, her mind racing through the architectural blueprints she'd memorized. "If he reaches the Black Room, the core server hub, he can execute a scorched earth protocol. It won't just steal your money. It will delete every record of the fraud, every email, every trace of his existence in this company. You'll be left holding the bag for a multi-billion-dollar ghost." She pulled her burner phone from her pocket. It was the only thing still powered, its screen a small blue island of light in the red dark. "I need to get into the subsector maintenance shaft. It's the only path that doesn't rely on the electronic gate system." They moved through the darkened corridors with the rhythmic precision of a tactical team. Georgina led, her tactical light cutting a sharp path through the gloom. She wasn't just walking. She was analyzing. She noted the way the air pressure changed near the vents, the specific click of the magnetic locks as they struggled for power. Suddenly, a screen on a nearby wall flickered to life, powered by an isolated circuit. Victor Crane's face appeared, his features sharp and pitiless in high definition. He wasn't sweating. He looked like he was presiding over a gala. "Harvey," Crane said, his voice echoing through the hallway speakers. And Ms. Holt, or should I call you by your unit designation? I must admit, I underestimated your resilience. But you're playing a game whose rules I wrote. The lockdown is total. In 12 minutes, the servers will purge, and I will walk out of the service entrance as a ghost. Don't make this difficult. Stay in the suite, and perhaps I'll leave the oxygen scrubbers on. The screen went black. He's overconfident, Georgina said, her fingers flying across her phone, slaving its processor to a maintenance port she'd found in the wall. He thinks because he built the walls, he knows where the cracks are. But he's a bureaucrat, Harvey. He plays by the manual. I've spent 3 years living in the gaps the manual forgets. She bypassed the maintenance hatch with a sharp, electronic chirp. Go, now! The climb through the shaft was grueling. The air was thin and smelled of heated copper and dust. Harvey followed her, his breathing heavy but determined. In the cramped vertical space, the barriers between them collapsed. There was no billionaire and no waitress here, just two people climbing toward a shared survival. Why didn't you leave? Harvey asked, his voice echoing in the metal tube. When you got that letter on your bed, you had a passport. You had a way out. Why stay for a man you barely know? Georgina paused, her hand gripping a cold steel rung. She looked down at him, her face partially obscured by shadows. Because for 3 years I've been a ghost, Harvey. And ghosts don't have anyone to fight for. When you sat with me in that study and didn't ask about my scars, you made me feel like a person again. I'm not saving an empire. I'm saving the first person who actually saw me. They reached the 40th floor. Georgina kicked open the grate and they tumbled into the hallway just as the red lights turned a frantic, strobing white. An alarm began to blare, a flat, digital scream. The purge has started. Georgina shouted over the noise. They reached the heavy vault doors of the black room. Outside, 2 of Crane's private security contractors stood guard, not with guns, but with high-voltage tasers and heavy tactical batons. I'll handle the gatekeepers, Harvey growled, stepping forward. You get to that terminal. No violence, Harvey, Georgina reminded him, grabbing his arm. She looked at the sprinkler system and the high-tension power line running along the ceiling. We do this my way. Intellectual warfare. She didn't charge the guards. She smashed a fire emergency glass and pulled a cable, shorting the floor's localized grid. The static discharge sent a blinding flash through the hallway, and the sudden surge caused the floor's automated fire suppression gas to vent. In the confusion and the blinding white fog, the guards stumbled, disoriented. Georgina didn't strike them. She slipped past like a shadow, her hand finding the manual override lever hidden behind a false panel, a flaw she'd found in the blueprints. Days ago, the vault hissed open. Inside. The black room was a cathedral of blinking blue lights and humming cooling fans. At the center stood Victor Crane, his fingers dancing over a glass console. He looked up, his face contorting in a mask of pure, cold rage. You're too late, Crane hissed, his hand hovering over the execute command. The encryption is locked. Even if you kill me, the data dies with me. Georgina stepped into the light of the servers, her expression calm, her eyes like flint. I don't need to kill you, Victor. And I don't need your password. She held up her burner phone, which was now hardwired to a small black device she'd taken from her bag. I realized something when I looked at your code last week. You're a perfectionist. You mirrored every drive to a backup in the cloud. You thought it was security. But a mirror is just a reflection. And reflections can be shattered. What are you doing? Crane's voice finally faltered. I'm not stopping the purge, Georgina said, a small, cold smile touching her lips. I'm redirecting it. Every bit of data you're trying to delete isn't disappearing. It's being uploaded to a public blockchain server. By the time you hit that button, the world won't just see your fraud. They'll see your bank accounts, your offshore shells, and the names of every person who helped you frame my team 3 years ago. Crane froze. His finger trembled above the glass. The countdown is at 30 seconds, Victor, Harvey said, stepping up beside Georgina, his hand resting firmly on her shoulder. Hit the button and go to prison for life. Or step away, and we might let the feds handle the arrest before the data goes public. The room was silent, save for the frantic ticking of the digital clock. The master of the empire stood defeated, not by a bullet, but by the brilliant mind of a woman he had dismissed as a waitress. Crane's hand dropped to his side. He slumped against the console, the predator finally defanged. "It's over," Georgina whispered, the adrenaline finally beginning to ebb, leaving her exhausted but whole. But as the lights of the building began to flicker back to life, she felt Harvey's grip tighten on her shoulder, not in fear, but in a silent promise. The war was won, but the story was just beginning. The silence that followed the restoration of power was heavy, but it was no longer the silence of a tomb. It was the silence of a verdict. As the overhead lights hummed to life, the high-resolution screens in the black room mirrored the collapse of Victor Crane's carefully constructed world. Federal agents, alerted by the data burst Georgina had initiated, were already flooding the ground floor. Victor Crane was let out in silence. He didn't look back. Men like him don't seek closure. They only seek exits, and Georgina had sealed every one of them. Harvey stood by the massive server array, the blue light catching the silver at his temples. He looked at the screens, then at his hands, and finally at Georgina. The untouchable billionaire looked for the first time like a man who had finally put down a weight he'd been carrying for 20 years. "It's done," he said, his voice thick with an emotion he couldn't quite name. "The evidence is in the hands of the Southern District. My name is clear. And yours, Georgina, the files you recovered from Crane's private drive. They don't just clear you. They implicate the men who framed your team." Georgina leaned against a cooling rack, the exhaustion hitting her like a physical wave. The 3 years of running, the 14 months of hiding in the velvet room, the fear of the dark, it all seemed to evaporate in the sterile air of the server room. "I didn't do it for the files, Harvey," she whispered. "I know," he said, stepping toward her. 1 month later, the New York skyline was bathed in the soft, golden hues of a setting sun. The penthouse of the Gibson building had been transformed. Gone were the shadows and the cold fortress-like atmosphere. The room was filled with light, flowers, and the hum of a different kind of power, the power of purpose. Georgina stood by the floor-to-ceiling windows, wearing a dress of deep emerald silk. Her auburn hair was no longer in a tight, practical braid. It flowed over her shoulders, soft and free. She looked at the invitation in her hand, the inaugural Gala of the Holt Gibson Foundation. The foundation wasn't just a tax haven or a vanity project. It was a shield. It was designed to provide legal, financial, and physical protection for whistleblowers, corporate victims, and those whose lives had been erased by the very systems she and Harvey now commanded. It was the legacy her team deserved. "You're thinking about them." Harvey's voice came from behind her. He walked to her side, dressed in a perfectly tailored tuxedo, but he had left the collar open, a small rebellion against the world he still owned. "Every day," she admitted, looking out at the city. "But for the first time, it doesn't hurt to remember. We gave them their names back, Harvey." He turned to her, his expression more serious than she had ever seen it. "You gave me my life back, Georgina. I spent 15 years building a wall of money and steel, thinking it would keep me safe. I didn't realize I was just building my own prison. You didn't just save my company. You saved the man inside it." He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small velvet box. There was no theater, no cameras, no audience of elite predators. Just two people who had survived the dark together. "I've spent my life making deals," Harvey said, his voice dropping to a sincere, raw whisper. "But this isn't a merger. It's a request. I don't want to run this empire without the woman who saw through it in 4 seconds. Georgina Holt, will you stay? Not as a consultant, not as a partner, but as my wife." The tears Georgina had been holding back for 3 years finally broke. She didn't need to analyze the risks. She didn't need an exit strategy. For the first time in her life, she was exactly where she was meant to be. "Yes," she breathed, stepping into his arms. "No more running." The camera pans out from the penthouse, soaring over the glittering lights of Manhattan. In a world that tries to make you invisible, sometimes the bravest thing you can do is let yourself be seen. Georgina Holt started as a ghost in a red apron and ended as the architect of a new kind of justice. She saved a billionaire, but together, they saved something much more important: their humanity. Every fairy tale has a hero, but in this city, the real heroes are the ones who find light in the blackout. If you've stayed with us until the very end, you're part of the Destiny Shift family. This story is a reminder that your past doesn't define your future. Your brilliance does. Drop a foundation in the comments if you believe in second chances. Don't forget to like and subscribe for more deep dives into the lives of the powerful and the resilient. Until next time, keep watching the shadows. You never know what genius is hiding in plain sight. If this story touched your heart, please don't forget to like the video and share your thoughts in the comments with those who believe that destiny can change everything one day. Subscribe because when destiny shifts, everything changes.